Well, good evening, everyone, and I hope you can hear me. I think it's 15 years since I finished teaching, so I'm not used to projecting my voice in a large room, but I'll do my best with the aid of my trusty bottle of water. I feel a bit fraudulent, really, because I'm pretty certain I shall not show you anything tonight that you're not already familiar with. And I probably shan't tell you anything that you don't already know. But hopefully there may be one or two things en route that you find out. And if we do have a few minutes at the end, you may well be able to correct me, add things to what I'm going to say. So what I'm going to look at is the way that Cambridge has developed since the 16th century or thereabouts. And, of course, it's still developing, perhaps at a faster pace than ever. I don't actually come into Cambridge all that often these days, perhaps once a fortnight, and things keep changing, both in the centre and in the suburbs. And wherever we go these days, this is the sort of thing that we see. This, of course, is a development south of Trumpington, Great Knighton, near Addenbrooks. And it's quite a long way back to the Little Cambridge of the early 19th century. This map is actually 1801, probably many of you are familiar with it, Cole and Roper's map, and it shows the town as it was in 1800, very small in terms of physical area. So down here, you're more or less at the Fitzwilliam Museum, there's Parker's Piece, there's the river, little bit of development on the northern side, not much else. About 10,000 population. And so we think that today things are changing. In the Victorian period, they were changing just as rapidly, perhaps even more dramatically. It may take you a moment or two to orient yourselves on this one, and let's see if I can get the pointer to work. No, I can't. Anyway, there's Parker's Piece. There, on the top left, is the old town of Cambridge, the historic centre as it is now. And it's a staggering thought that virtually everything we can see on that map, certainly in terms of the street layout, one or two new buildings obviously, was built between about 1810 and 1890. And it must have been just as traumatic, I think, for the inhabitants of Cambridge in the 19th century to see how the open countryside around the town was disappearing as it is for us today. And my text for this evening, brethren, as they would say, is this. Oxford is a university in a town. Cambridge, a town in a university. Thanks to Chris Briggs of Selwyn, I eventually ran the source of this to earth. Been looking for it for years, and it's Thomas Fuller writing in the 17th century. And I think, certainly down to the 1950s, that will probably hold true. It doesn't really hold true today. But if you know Oxford and you know Cambridge, they are very different in terms of character and what they look like. And it's interesting that Cambridge City Council actually use the university, the most famous building probably in Cambridge, as part of their logo. There's nothing in the town that they could find to use. They have to use this. And my subtext for this evening, the tradesmen may justly be said to get their bread by the colleges. This is Daniel Defoe writing in the 1720s. And again, it's something that would hold true, I think, right down to the middle of the 20th century. And of course, it's an awkward relationship between town and gown, always has been. There is resentment on the side of the town, particularly the way that they are dependent on the university, and the way that the university and the colleges are supposedly holding things back, economic development, and they are also interfering in town affairs. And the role of a university perhaps symbolised, most of all, by this fine body of men and indeed two women on the right-hand side there, the proctors and their bulldogs, authorised in an Act of 1825 to effectively exercise police powers within 5 miles of Great St Mary's. greatly resented, of course, and here they are still in all their regalia. Whenever I look at this photograph, I imagine they're about to sort of burst into song. Looks just like something in Gilbert and Sullivan when proctoring duties to be done. A bulldog's lot is not a happy one. However, we will move on. Now, as it were, the interference by the colleges, as it's seen from the university, starts well before 1500. And in a sense, that sets the pattern for what was to go on for the next 400 or 500 years, because it's the colleges that destroy what had been the old commercial heart of Cambridge. The old centre of Cambridge had been Milne Street, which ran north-south, more or less parallel to Trinity Street and King's Parade, and this was the street near the river. It's surrounded by merchants' houses. There are passages and alleyways going down to the river, to the various little staiths or hives that were handling commodities like coal and timber, and it is destroyed as a street in the 14th and 15th centuries, and it's symbolised by the fact that King's Chapel sits very square and fair, as you can see there, over what had been this major commercial thoroughfare. Well, what did it look like back in the 16th century? The short answer to that is we don't really know. There are maps starting in the 16th century. This is the earliest lines map of 1574. This is just an extract from it. And it shows the street layout. It gives an attempt to show what some of the churches were like. So you've got St. Clement's at the top there. Over here you've got St. Pulchre's, as they call it. This, of course, is a church of the Holy Sepulchre, which at some point in the late Middle Ages is just abbreviated by everybody in Cambridge to St. Pulchre. So they invent this saint who continues to appear on maps, in fact, right through to the early 19th century. But in terms of the actual what the town looked like, it doesn't help us. I mean, it's very much like a child's drawing of a town. All the houses look the same. And 20 years later, Hammond's map of 1594, far more detailed, and has certainly got details of the colleges, right? So you've got here, for example, Trinity College, the chapel slightly elongated. But once again, the houses are just there. He's just sort of filled it in. May give some idea of the density of population, but not much else. And continues through the 17th century. The two famous Logan the illustrations, Cambridge from the east and Cambridge from the west, give some idea of the importance of college buildings and churches. Don't show anything in the way of domestic architecture. And Logan's very detailed illustrations of the colleges, which are done more or less the same time, 1680s, 1690s, again, only show the colleges. This one, many of you will know, this is Keys, and it shows purely the buildings of Keys. What it doesn't show is the fact that down here, where he's got what looks like quite a wide thoroughfare, this is a tenant house passage, that didn't actually exist. There were houses all the way along here. That wall was probably there. There were houses here. He ignores them completely. And it's the same thing on all the other illustrations of colleges. It's only the early 19th century that we do start to get some illustrations. This is one of the earliest. This is Rowlandson's drawing of the marketplace, dating from 1805. And all we've got to do is try to use our imaginations to go back and see what Cambridge looked like before. And Bridge Street is probably as good a place as any, because here you've got, obviously, a rather nice selection of outwardly 16th, 17th century houses. There's a Victorian intruder in the middle there, but all of the rest of them are 16th, 17th centuries. And, of course, these are the houses of prosperous townspeople. Shopkeepers, living over the shop almost invariably, and tradesmen of one sort or another, people like clothiers, cobblers, so on and so forth. They're the well-off. But what is not so obvious is that immediately behind, you get into a rabbit warren of courtyards and alleyways, and rich and poor are living cheek by jowl. So you can see here we've got St. Clement's up there, there's the Round Church down there, and all of these, which are still there to some extent, are where the working population of Cambridge live. And difficult to know what it was like. There are photographs. This is from the 1930s. This is a different area. This is Tunwell's Yard in Trumpington Street. And this is a watercolour by Grace Pollock, as you can see, mid-1930s. Gives some impression of what it must have been like. But things are starting to change. And in particular, of course, the colleges are always building. And this is Wren's Pembroke Chapel of 1665, which, when it appeared at the time, must have seemed absolutely shocking to the people of Cambridge. This is their first taste of modern architecture by an up-and-coming young architect. This is his first major building, and he seems to have got the job of Pembroke Chapel largely because his uncle, Matthew Wren, was Bishop of Ely, so it all helps. What we don't get in Cambridge is any really major Georgian development. If you go to Wisbech or if you go to Stamford, you'll find there's quite a lot of terraced housing from the Georgian period, quite very elegant terraced housing. In Cambridge, it isn't like that. We just get one or two examples of individual properties. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Master's Lodge at Peterhouse, which wasn't actually built as the Master's Lodge. It was built for a doctor, and he left it to Peterhouse in 1725, and it was taken over as the Master's Lodge. And on the right-hand side, we've got Little Trinity in Jesus Lane, again, round about 1720 or thereabouts. Well, the big change, of course, I'm sure you all know this, comes with the Enclosure of the Open Fields in 1807. Cambridge is surrounded by these vast open fields, which, although individual plots in the fields belonged to individual farmers, there were common rights over all of them for grazing, etc. This is all swept away at Enclosure. These plots are now people's individual property. They can do what they like with them. And thankfully, the town can start to grow outwards. Towns where this didn't happen could only grow in on themselves. The classic example of that is Nottingham, where the open fields weren't enclosed until 1840. And Nottingham had to grow not just in on itself, but actually down as well. There are people living in caves in Nottingham by the 1830s. And it was said at the time, probably with some justification, the worst slums in the British Empire outside Bombay. And Cambridge didn't get like that because it is able to grow out. And you can see here what's happening. It's the Barnwell field, the East field, which is starting to develop. So you've got Newmarket Road along there, the new East Road there, and down here we've got Hills Road, Mill Road there with the mill. And the interesting thing about this, it's all rather piecemeal, isn't it? It isn't sort of growing out as you might imagine. It's a very patchy development. And this is what it means. We're not so much on the ground, but this is what is happening. On the left-hand side, you've got the population of the town itself, the borough, starting from 1801 through to 1931. You can see there's a break in the sequence there. And this is because after 1851, the census was taken in university vacation time. So before this, it includes students. After this, it doesn't. And the big jump there in 1921 is because of the incorporation of Trumpington and Chesterton. And of course, the vast majority of this new population are living in this parish where we are now, the parish of St Andrew the Less, the area always known simply as Barnwell. And you can see what's happening. It's going from a handful of people, really, a couple of hundred in 1801, shooting up, a bit of a pause there in 1851 to 61, and then up again under the 1920s. And who's doing this? Well, all sorts of people. The most important figure in the early development of suburban Cambridge, again, I'm sure you've all heard of him, Charles Humphrey. Man of many parts, a trained but amateur architect, also a banker, and it's Humphrey who developed the areas nearest to the town from about 1811 onwards, starting with the Doll's Close development. This was already enclosed. This wasn't actually something that was part of the Enclosure Act. But enclosed since the 18th century because it was the site originally chosen for Downing College before they decided it was going to be too small. Humphrey bought it and builds this interesting development, the big houses here facing onto Maid's Causeway, big but relatively narrow. They're only one room deep. Smaller houses in Short Street there, Fair Street, and in Willow Walk. And it's Willow Walk which is perhaps the most significant, because it does really set a pattern for what follows. This is it. It's built around about 1820 or thereabouts. Very interesting in many respects, the way that the front doors are grouped together, as you can see, so you get two front doors next to each other. And also, the fact that the rooms interlock inside. You don't get a straight party wall, somebody's bedroom's over somebody else's hall and this sort of thing. It's all very, very complicated, but you can work it out if you go down Willow Walk by the colours that the windows are painted in. That's the giveaway. And what Humphrey does is to put in the middle this rather nice, slightly standing forward bit with the pediment, the pilasters, to give some sort of focus to what would otherwise be a not particularly interesting terrace. And this is followed by other people. Eden Street. About 10 years later, around about 1830, 1832, this is not Humphrey, this is Jesus College. One of the major landowners in Cambridge, doing exactly the same. As you can see, you've got the pediment and the pilasters in the middle. It was obviously intended to have another terrace facing this one. If you go down Eden Street, you will see that on the other side of the road, there is a little bit of it that was never extended. And this is built for respectable tradespersons and craftsmen. The people living there in the 1850s are people like cobblers, dressmakers, gown makers, etc. And slightly more at market, in fact considerably more at market, New Square, which took about 10 years to build. They started on the southern side and eventually moved round, and this is the north side. It's, again, a Jesus development. What's one or two interesting things about it? The terraces, at first glance, all look identical. They're still using this Humphrey signature, if you like, of the central pediment. They do actually differ in detail, and it's worth walking around and just noting what these details are. This is actually much more typical, though. Could have chosen almost any street in the Kite area. It's small-scale development. What tends to happen much more characteristically is that individual builders, individual bricklayers, plumbers, etc., buy up a property, buy up a bit of land, and put houses on it. And again, in a very piecemeal fashion. So in Grafton Street, this was the first house there, and these houses which, again, if you look carefully, they're identical. These were only built about 40 years later on what had been the garden of that big house in the middle. And East Road is significant in a lot of ways. It's a new road at the time of Enclosure. There probably had been a track along where East Road runs, but it wasn't a proper road. And one of the things you will notice is that the ground falls away quite rapidly on this side. I can remember when I was teaching what was then the Tech, this was a bit of a problem getting out of the car park in those happy days when we could actually park there. My old Ford Escort didn't like it one little bit, particularly on cold days, and you always had this awful feeling you were going to conk just as you went round the corner into East Road. Well, the reason it's not so good is that this side was very low-lying, very boggy, very marshy, very low-value land, and it developed quite differently. So you've got respectable Barnwell on this side, you've got anything but respectable Barnwell on the other side. This is it on Spalding's map of the 1880s. Here's East Road, and here's all this rabbit warren, once again of streets, which was known simply as Barnwell, and to the property classes, a no-go area. And here we've got what the Cambridge Chronicle said in 1853, and I will leave you to read that whilst I take liquid refreshment.
Can you read it at the back there?
No. Barnwell, it says, is the focus of villainy, the receptacle of dishonest spoil. Oops. There's my dishonest spoil. Fashioned by the hand of crime, air of dissoluteness about every place. Old Gas Lane, the receptacle of all the physical dross of Cambridge. Crispin Passage, they eye you with a restless glance and then shun your sight. They are for the greater part idle, dissolute characters. The women live partly supported by their paramours, by perpetual dishonour. And so it goes on, hole in the wall, a model of wretchedness. It has guilt stamped in its very walls. It was built, one would think, as a nursery of crime. Can't help feeling the reporter had been reading Dickens a bit too much. And it's not alone. I'm not going to talk in detail about this. This is Newtown. Developed at more or less the same time between Trumpington Street, Hills Road there. Very interesting and very complicated because of the pattern of land ownership here. So you get very respectable houses being built by people like the Pemberton family, cheek by jowl almost, with this area up here around Saxon Street, which was just as bad as the darkest bits of Barnwell. And perhaps, I don't know whether it's significant or not, developed by the son of the Archbishop of York, who was the landowner. Honor Ridout is the person who probably knows most about Barnwell, and if you haven't had her, it's worth getting her to give a talk. Another big landowner, Caius College. At the time of Enclosure, Caius got these two areas here. There's Mill Road, there's Hills Road. So he gets a plot on the corner of Hills Road and Gonville Place, and a plot down Mill Road. Well, the landowner, who was given most of the land, died. And you can see it here, the late Mr. Banton. Sold by auction, 1809, just after Enclosure. And Caius bought some more land. So he bought all of this lot, the sale, this lot as well, and subsequently bought these two yellow bits added here. And the consequence was that the bits that Caius didn't have were actually developed quite quickly. So Covent Garden, probably certainly it's in the 1851 census, I don't think it's in the 1841 census. By 1851, it's more or less as it is today. And what's interesting is that this, what seems essentially urban landscape, is actually in the middle of open countryside at the time. It's surrounded by fields and market gardens because Keys hasn't really got any interest yet in developing. The change starts to come, I think, once fellows of colleges were allowed to marry. This is Mortimer Road, which is one of the earliest bits of the Keys's exploitation of this area. And it may well be to do, I can't prove this at all, it may well be to do with the fact that Keys was the first college to allow its fellows to marry and retain their fellowships, which it did in 1861. So there's now a demand for bigger houses. What really gets Keys going, though, is this, and these figures probably speak for themselves. The Great Agricultural Depression from the mid-1870s onwards, when English arable farming just effectively ceases to become worthwhile because of foreign competition. And Keys was a major landowner, one of the major landowners in Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire. And you can see here what's happened in the space of 10 years. The rents that Keys is getting from Caxton, 150 down to 81, Denver, up in Norfolk, near Downham Market, even more dramatic, 645 down to 193 10 years earlier, and it's 10 years later. And it's not surprising that Keys started now to look at its Barnwell estate with new eyes. This is an area where it can make up for what it's lost. And it does. And of course, here we've got Glisson Road. Again, a very interesting road because of a big change in character halfway or two-thirds of the way along as you move from the area that Keys had to the area that had already been developed around the Covent Garden by individual private developers. Glisson Road really is going to be an important road from the Hills Road end. It's wide, it's straight, etc. And then it suddenly effectively peters out. And like all the roads in this part of Cambridge, named after a fellow, they all got Keys names, and Glisson was a 17th century Regius Professor of Physic, in other words, of medicine. And the same thing is happening north of the river. And the development of what was called New Chesterton, and here we've got Chesterton Road along here, here's Huntingdon Road, there's Histon Road. This is outside the borough. This is one reason why it develops quite rapidly, about the 1840s onwards, because land is slightly cheaper, the rates are lower outside central Cambridge. And so it becomes a basically respectable working class suburb. Its big problem being the lack of access to the town. And if you look on many of these ordnance survey maps down to the 1890s, you will see the large number of ferries going across. People ferried across and then just walking into town over Midsummer Common or Jesus Green. And Herbert Street is very typical of the sort of houses that are being put up. I said it is respectable working class. This is what changes it all. The new Victoria Avenue of 1888, 1889, a joint venture by Chesterton and the Borough of Cambridge, and finally giving Chesterton a direct or more direct road access to the centre. And of course, the lovely Victoria Avenue Bridge is built as part of this. And I believe, I'm not totally certain, but I believe that the girders were the last major cargo to be brought at the Cam before navigation really ceased. And Victoria Avenue in place, then we get what the estate agents always seem to call the favoured de Freville estate, which developed from 1892 onwards with quite expensive houses. They cost about £400 when they were built, which was a lot of money in those days. By 1895, there were about 40 houses on the site, and it just developed thereafter. what's happening back in the town centre? Well, one interesting thing is that the colleges have been quite hidden away, or many of them had. There are exceptions. I mean, obviously, John's with its gatehouse, Trinity, Christ's, etc. But many of them are effectively masked from the street by domestic buildings and shops. From the 1820s onwards, this all changes. The colleges start to effectively expand out and have a new physical presence. And this is Corpus, 1825, new Gothic, in inverted commas, or with a K, frontage by William Wilkins, Fellow of Keys. King's Screen Wall, same period, 1825, 1830. They simply sweep away all the property on the west side of King's Parade and replace it with this very nice little Gothic fantasy. And on the right-hand side, of course, St. John's, in 1830, becomes the first college to actually jump over the river. And it reflects this number of students. The 18th century, students, very few students, in fact. In 1810, it's gone to 235, 1830, 440, 1870, 605, 1890, 965. This is just the annual admission, so you've got to multiply these by 3 effectively to get the number of students. And it means the colleges have to grow. And Keys, once again, is quite a good example of this. The problem with Keys is it's on a very small site. The original bit, Gonville Court, the Keys Court, 16th century, but hemmed in by Trinity Street, the new Senate House Passage, and Trinity Lane at the top. And all it can do is grow in on itself. And it starts doing that in the 1850s with this new, very nice hall and library block, which is up there, designed by an architect called Anthony Salvin, who's best known for designing country houses. And in fact, it almost is like a small country house put down in Keys. It's got all the properties of a small country house. And it's followed, 20 years later, by what I called here Cambridge Sur Loire, the new tree court, designed by the very up-and-coming, youngish architect, Alfred Waterhouse. Not a Cambridge man, the practice was in Manchester, and Waterhouse had travelled extensively when he was a student in the Loire Valley, and as a practicing architect, he gave Keys in 1870 what is in fact effectively a Loire chateau on the corner of Trinity Street and Senate House Passage. And you can trace virtually every architectural detail on Tree Court back to the individual chateaux which he'd seen and which he'd sketched 20 years earlier. It is, of course, unfortunate that it rather doesn't quite go with the Senate House. This, I think, is deliberate, or almost deliberate, because at the time, 1870, relations between the university and the colleges were very bad. The colleges resenting what they saw as the growing power of the university over teaching, over policy, etc. And I think that this Tree Court is Keys effectively putting 2 fingers up to the university and saying, this is what we think of you. And the university itself now does start to build, which it hadn't before. Starting with the Pitt Press, 1830, by Bloor. The one on the right, you will not know, this is one of the thankfully rejected designs for the Fitzwilliam Museum. And one can't quite imagine how on earth it could possibly have worked. What we got, of course, was Besaver's magnificent Grecian building, which is perhaps more than any other symbolises this new power of the university, new sense of self-confidence. And it's followed by faculty buildings of one sort or another, as increasingly the responsibility for teaching passes to the university rather than the colleges. Basil Champner's divinity schools, and over here, somewhat later, mainly Edwardian buildings on the new museum site. Big buildings, very difficult to love these buildings, I think. I mean, it always strikes me as a very grim sort of academic canyon as you walk down there. And, of course, new colleges. Newnham, perhaps the most attractive of them all. Once again, Basil Champney is working in a very different idiom. You can see here he's gone in domestic revival. Newnham, one of the interesting things about it is that it was built so that if the college failed, it could be transformed into housing very easily. And that's why it looks so domestic. And of course, the college didn't fail. Theological colleges, Ridley Hall, and also, of course, much closer to home, the County School for Girls and the School of Art, what eventually becomes the Tech, designed by the county architect. And this interference, if you like, in the townscape continues certainly into the 1930s. And Keys, once again, at the forefront here, with the extension to St Michael's Court, which is Edwardian and goes round Rose Crescent, designed by Murray Wilson, built between 1934 and 1936. And in fact, probably one of the best mannered interwar buildings in Cambridge. Right, pause for a bit more liquid refreshment, and you feast your eyes on Cambridge Station. Very well known illustration, Illustrated London News, a fanciful illustration, I think it must be said. The artist doesn't seem to have realized that if you have a train and a railway line and a platform, they should ideally be somewhere near each other. But nonetheless, he's done well, and he's certainly got the building right. This is what it looked like, the famous single platform and the two arcades. The one on the right, covering the platform and the track that was alongside the platform. The one on the left, the carriage entrance for carriage folk, so they don't get wet. And still survives today, of course, in a very modified form. The arcade on the railway side went in 1862. The arcade here, though, on the town side, continues until today. That window represents where it was. And, of course, the station is in the open countryside and remains very much in the open countryside until the 1880s, 1890s. Kept away by the pressure of the colleges, fearful of the moral effects of the railway on the undergraduates, that is putting London within too easy reach. New Station Road laid out in 1845. And this map, 1881, shows, again, just how rural it still was. And here we've got the station, the great 1845, and here we've got what people, I think, often don't realise is effectively a separate station built for the Great Northern Railway. And today's Platform 3. The Great Eastern and the Great Northern did not get on. So the Great Northern effectively is forced to have its own station, part of the main station, but separate in all respects. So in booking office, waiting rooms, refreshment facilities, staff facilities, etc. This was built in 1866, 1867, at a time when the Great Northern, since about 1864, had been trying to get into central Cambridge. What it really wanted was a station there, Christ pieces, ideal. Either a new line coming in from somewhere out in the Barton direction, coming up from Shepworth. The alternative, they thought, was to have running powers through Cambridge Station and then build a new line along the north side of Mill Road. Problem being it wouldn't go through the cemetery, but that was no major drawback. And terminating on Christ Pieces, nice and central. Not, though, as you might imagine, appreciated by Emmanuel College and Christ College, that would find themselves effectively in the station yard, and not surprising, it didn't go through. And here is the station by 1911, looking southwards towards the station, and the reason I'm showing this is just to mention, I've talked about this before, the Newmarket line, 1851, curving away there from the middle of platform 4, and crossing all the other lines on the level, major operational inconvenience, and then running along the south side of Mill Road. So there it goes, along there, and there's Mill Road there. And it was only in 1896 that after a great deal of negotiation, the Great Eastern finally got permission to build the new line over Coldham's Common there. It had to buy some additional land to give to the town in lieu of crossing the common. And so from 1896, this is the main line to Newmarket. But this line continued to be there, used as a siding, until the 1920s. And this is, you can see very clearly today where it ran. This is Marlborough Road. On the left-hand side, you've got the roads coming off Mill Road. On the right-hand side there, that's more or less where the railway ran. And this is the reason why you get this very dramatic break in sort of the character of this bit of Cambridge between the Victorian bit and the 1920s bit. It's only when the line was finally removed, around about 1925, that the suburban area could move southwards. And, of course, we can't leave the railway without mentioning Romsey, the railway quarter of Cambridge, dominated by the railway in terms of employment, very much a place on its own, isolated until the building of Mill Road Bridge by a level crossing that was very rarely open, very self-contained, and, of course, notoriously radical. Red Romsey is the phrase that's being used from the early 20th century, in spite of the Conservative Club further down, and in spite of the extremely Tory names of some of the pubs, particularly the Earl of Beaconsfield there, in the days when it didn't have that awful effigy of Disraeli outside. It got a much better pub sign, which is there. And this is Romsey and Mill Road, as it was by the 21st century. Here's Mill Road going down there. There's the railway. And this is all this massive development that's taken place by the First World War. But on the other side of the railway, the town side of the railway, is quite different. And the big landowner here was once again Jesus College. Jesus did very nicely out of the railway because the station was built on Jesus' land, in spite of the opposition to the railway of the master of Jesus, Dr. Corrie, who was, if not a conservative with a small c. It was said of Dr. Corrie that he was always looking for the last ditch to die in. And certainly he did his best to keep the railway away, but Jesus College does nicely out of it. But were determined that Station Road was going to be upmarket. And that's why you get these big houses being built from the late 1860s onwards, of which very few, of course, survive nowadays, in the hope that this would become a desirable residential area. It didn't quite work out as they hoped, largely, I think, because just round the corner, you've got that, the Loco Yard. And this is it, round about 1958, 1959. Lovely selection of engines there. You've got a standard Class 5, you've got an L1, you've got an L Great Eastern B12 over there. And what it does show in terms of townscape is what were really the two most prominent buildings in Cambridge in the 1950s. Foster's Mill in the background there, and the mechanical coaling plant, which was put in, I think, in 1934 from memory, which was, I think, probably the tallest building in Cambridge. you could see it from all over the place. And of course, it eventually demolished with dieselisation with very great difficulty. It was extremely well built. And just a reminder, this had some idea of the extent of the railway in Cambridge. 1922, aerial view, looking south, Hills Road there, station here, vast numbers of sidings, as you can see, compared to what there is today. And what's happening in the background there, that's the Royal Show. And there was actually a station built over here near Long Road to serve the Royal Show. And, of course, along the railway, you get what I've called the other Cambridge, industrial Cambridge. This collection of all sorts of things, coprolite works, iron foundries, timber yards, the co-op milk depot, gasworks sidings, etc. Workaday industrial Cambridge. Most notably, of course, the Eagle Foundry, just off Mill Road, which, just before we leave the railway, is famed for building the only steam locomotive ever built in Cambridge, the Eagle of 1849, built to pull light branch line trains. That was how they tried to sell it. Major problem, it could hardly move itself, let alone pull a train. In consequence, it spent its last years as an inspection saloon. So that's why it's got this thing on the back. And eventually disgraced itself because it ran over the divisional signal engineer somewhere near Norwich. And nobody seems to know what happened to it. And of course, moving further north, further industry, brickworks, the last remaining brickworks in Cambridge, the Cambridge Brick Company, where the Coral Park retail estate is now, closed in 1940. As I've probably shown you this photograph before, but just to remind you of the story, I was out taking photographs, and you all remember the Kodachrome 36 exposures. And I got 36 exposures, but one always tried to see if you could get number 37, just by taking something. And so I thought, I'll stand on Coldham's Lane Bridge, take a photograph of the old brickworks chimney. This was on a Friday. On Sunday, it was blown up. So I'm very glad that I did. Right, back into town. Lots of commercial activity, of course. Cambridge is constantly being renewed in the 19th century. New commercial buildings, the Corn Exchange, by one of the most prolific Cambridge architects, Richard Rowe. You find his work all over the place. Built almost too late, it must be said. Built on the eve of the agricultural depression, never really justified its existence, and of course was threatened with demolition for many years, but thankfully saved. And banks, big new feature. And this proves, as I say, that it's not only the colleges who can afford to hire big names in architecture, the Fosters, who are the wealthiest family in Victorian Cambridge, bankers, millers, etc., hire Waterhouse once again towards the end of his career for their new bank of 1895 on this rather awkward site between Hobson Street and St Andrews Street. But he provides them with what effectively is a sort of, well, it's quite at home in Amsterdam or Rotterdam or something like that. And of course, it has the most spectacular interior in Cambridge, apart from King's College Chapel. And it's very little known, but it's worth just going in and admiring it. It really is quite spectacular. Moving on into war period, this is really when council housing gets off the ground. There were a few council houses built before the First World War. The problem was money. Ratepayers not very happy with the council spending their money on housing the working classes. After the First World War, it's different. Homes Fit for Heroes was a bit of an empty promise. But nonetheless, money is now available from central government in the form of loans and grants, and council houses become a possibility. Most of them, certainly in the 20s, following this sort of model, which is the work of Raymond Unwin. Unwin, of course, one of the two architects of the Letchworth Garden City, and using the Letchworth model for model council housing. He moved to the local government board in the First World War, which eventually became the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, and produced standard designs that councils could follow. It's much easier than hiring their own architects, and this is one of them. And here's the sort of thing that developed as a consequence of what some of the first council housing in Cambridge, Hinton Avenue, off Hills Road, developed around about 1923. And in the 1930s, conditions are, or economic conditions are a bit harder. The houses are less glamorous in the 30s, but still very practical, and these are the ones in Brooks Road. And of course, also housing societies. In Cambridge, you've got the Cambridge Housing Society, followed a few years later, I think 1928, by the 100 Houses Society. There was a falling out in the Cambridge Housing Society, and so the 100 Houses Society was set up, and this is the sort of thing they were building. And the university, or the college, is of course always different, and this is where you do get some very consciously avant-garde houses, quite different to the council houses, and Condit Head Road, off Madingley Road, is the place to go to see them. This is Thurso, which was, can't remember the architect, I've got it in my notes, built 1934, 1935, and really glaringly modern. And of course, the car. How do you fit Cambridge to the motor vehicle, or do you fit the motor vehicle to Cambridge? Well, in the 1920s, the assumption was that you fitted Cambridge to suit the motor vehicle. And this is where planning controversies start, with this, Fen Causeway, 1925, 1926, built to really do two things, partly to mop up unemployment in the immediate post-war period, partly to relieve pressure on Silver Street. Silver Street Bridge was very narrow, carrying an increasing amount of traffic, and this, connecting Barton Road and Trumpington Road, would relieve it. The idea was also to have bathing sheds underneath the road. That never quite caught on, perhaps luckily. And this is built amidst tremendous controversy because of the fact that it's nibbling away at Cove Fen. So, you know, for 100 years now, we've had people complaining about, or not complaining about, but advocating conservation against the wishes of sometimes the planners. Second big controversy, Drummer Street. Drummer Street, even more controversial in a sense, because it involved taking a bit of Christ to pieces. Buses previously had terminated really just at the Marketplace, Senate House area. We decided a bus station was needed, and so the Drummer, as it was always called, develops, and here it is, obviously much later. This is probably around about 1970, with, some of you may well remember, the inquiry office in the middle, for Premier Travel, or the Premier, as it was always known in Cambridge, and a couple of the Premier's rather nice coaches parked up there. Also, interwar period, the one-way system, which was introduced a bit piecemealish round about 1930. And of course, it was a very odd one-way system, as some of you may remember, because the way it operated was that traffic had to cross itself twice, at the Round Church and at the end of Market Street where it met St Andrew's Street. It was, of course, also a bit of a rat run. But here we've got Trinity Street, a photograph I took when I was an undergraduate. Again, I can't quite remember why I took this one, but I'm rather glad I did. And also the first parking restrictions at the same time, which were a bit odd, because you could park on different sides of the street, depending whether it was an even-numbered or an odd-numbered date. So you got to remember to look at your calendar before you took your car into Cambridge, so you knew which side to park on. And then, okay, let's get the traffic out of Cambridge. The idea was an eastern bypass, and this is what happened. This is between 1925 and 1935. The idea is go round the eastern side of Cambridge. It's a long road, which had just been Trumpington Drift, not very important at all, going along here, along Brooks Road, etc. And then the idea was to go over Coldham's Common, along there, and then over there to join Milton Road. And of course, it was never completed. In the 1970s, the bit over Coldham's Common was finally built, but the other bits there, and the bridge over the railway never came to fruition. But nonetheless, it did, like so many bypasses, act as a magnet to developers. And the area along Pern Road is really a textbook example of 1930s semi-detached, often mock Tudor development. And thanks to Nicky for taking this one, this is what was intended to be a roadhouse. This is where in Milton Road, this is the Milton Arms, this is where the bypass would join Milton Road, and it was assumed that this would become really a major meeting point for travellers, residents, etc. It's a lovely building, designed by Munro Courtley, who was a Suffolk architect who practiced in Ipswich, and also wrote extensively on Suffolk churches. And as you can see here, he was very keen on Jacobean architecture, and this is it. And all over you get this new rush of suburban development. This, you may not recognise, this is Queen Edith's Way. Where we are, we're looking down towards Cherry Hinton. So if you're with me, the traffic lights, they're there. Cherry Hinton Road is there. The Robin Hood, the pub, is there. And here you've got this lovely, bucolic, rural scene, soon to disappear. And, of course, this, again, hotly debated. 1932, I think, the Christ Peace was taken over for parking. Of course, it totally destroyed any appreciation of the architecture of New Square. But it must be said, I had parked there on many occasions, and it was incredibly convenient. But not as convenient as that. The happy days when you could park your Robin Reliant outside Robert Sales, nip in, get something, and come out again and hop into it, or into your Volkswagen or your Mini or whatever it might be. Post-war, again, it's council housing that tends to take the lead in the 50s and 60s. And this is East Cambridge. Again, you will, I think, perhaps have difficulty recognising. That's Elizabeth Way. That's probably the best way to start. There's Newmarket Road. There's Barnwell Junction. There's the gasworks. The river, you can see, curving round there. This is the massive development of the 1950s. Cambridge, one of the most active of councils in council housing. And this is starts immediately after the Second World War with prefabs, of course, as temporary accommodation, built because they were prefabricated. They can be put up by unskilled labour. The factories that were producing for the war can easily move on to producing these. And these are the ones in Lichfield Road. And by 1946, within a year, Cambridge had put up 450 prefabs, so you can see just what's going on. And these new suburbs, dependent, of course, on the bus. You could really call them the bus suburbs. And here we've got, again, many of you probably queued there in your time outside just opposite Marks and Spencer's, and again a scene which is very difficult to imagine nowadays. And I imagine that chap on the bike is probably now a religious professor of road safety or something. But, I don't know. And if you're going the other way, again, you may well remember you stood outside Bradwell's Court, and if you were lucky, you could get in a shelter. You usually weren't lucky enough. And Bradwell's Court itself, of course, has now disappeared. Again, it shows how the commercial architecture of the town continues to evolve. It was very widely admired at the time. There was an article in, I think it was the New Statesman, about 1965, that waxed lyrical over Bradwell's Court. And it said if you went to Bradwell's Court at sunset, You could well imagine yourself in Rotterdam. Well, possibly. But it was actually rather a pleasant building. It's, right, next one. And then, of course, we get the Arbory. Arbory, the major development of the 1960s, an aerial view of one of the first bits of the Arbory estate. And to modern eyes, I think, what is interesting about this is the very low density of housing. Compared to modern development, of course, where you're cramming in as much as you can, these houses are well spaced, they've got good gardens, etc. It was bound to change, of course, and later Arbory becomes multi-storey flats. And finally, you'll be relieved to know just a very quick look at the modern scene. And of course, in this period, until the 1980s onwards, really, it's the deindustrialization of Cambridge, which is perhaps the most important factor. And again, this is a photograph I got quite by chance, just walking around there. This is the end of Pye. This is their factory in Chesterton being developed for, redeveloped for housing. And, of course, the area around the station, CB1, the old grey Northern Goods Yard, as it was here, with the Jesus College villas in the background there, now becomes this. And similarly, outside the station, what had been very much a railway area, totally redeveloped in the early 21st century. This building here, which many of you will remember, this rather nice, very well-mannered sort of 1720s type building. This was the Divisional Civil Engineers Office. And behind it, quite in contrast, the Great Eastern House, which again was a railway building. It was built to be the headquarters of the Cambridge Division of British Railways. They built it and immediately abolished the Cambridge Division of British Railways, moved all the stuff to Norwich and London, and by mid-1960s, only one floor of it was in use because the control office was still there that looked after the day-to-day running of the trains. Went through a variety of ownerships. Afterwards, the Forestry Commission was there, South Cambridge District Council were there, and of course, eventually demolished, and now you've got this very different approach to the station. And continuing the theme, the Grafton Centre, what had just been the local shopping centre for this part of Cambridge, totally redeveloped in the 1970s, 1980s, again with massive controversy. It was a scheme that had been first proposed in 1951, but Cambridge being Cambridge, of course, it takes a while to get things going. And of course, even this now threatened with yet more redevelopment. This is the latest plans that appeared about 10 days ago of the fact that the retailing bit will now just be at that end of it, little bit of retail down there on East Road, the rest of it becoming life sciences, hotel, etc. And finally, of course, we're getting the out-of-town developments, which there isn't time to go into, Northstowe and so on. This is the nearest in the sense of the in-town development, Eddington. Once again, it's the university, of course, which is leading the way here. This was built almost entirely for university staff and students, although they are now starting to put up some private housing. But it is very much, once again, an academic enclave. And if you haven't been out there, it's worth going just to have a look at it. It's so different in character to the rest of the town. And so, nearly there, very famous illustration, Pugin, Contrasts, 1839, Augustus Welby Pugin, the architect. This is his idealization of a medieval city. And if you stand on top of the Grafton Centre, it's not actually too different. Pugin will probably be quite pleased with that, although I must admit, if he turned round the other way and saw things like the Mark in the distance, he would be perhaps less pleased. And it must be remembered, of course, that this is just one side of the coin. The town is constantly developing, but there are other sides of it. And then when I look at this, think of William Blake's lines, "Is this a holy thing to see in a rich and fruitful land?" And with that thought, I will leave you. Thank you for your patience. 10 minutes.
Well, you didn't disappoint. That was amazing. Yes. It's covered my entire life and my sister. Everywhere you were mentioning in the second half of the 20th century as part of my life. So thank you very much for that.
Right, so come on, tell me where I've gone wrong.
Any questions?
You did go wrong. On one page you said Northern Arms and it's the Golden Hind.
Thank you. I just couldn't remember what it is.
This is a man who doesn't have any
Yeah.
bits of paper.
Yeah.
Back there, please. Back there.
What I was hoping to hear is the influence or the effect of the other university on the development of the town.
Anglia Ruskin? Yes. Well, I mean, its influence has been quite extensive in recent years. I mean, it obviously at the start it is effectively just an appendage to the county school for girls. That moved out in 1939-40 and went up to the Long Road. And the intention was that the School of Art, which by this time had become, I think, the School of Art and Technology, the idea was that that was going to follow. And they actually bought a site. If you go down Trumpington Road, Long Road goes off to the left when you get to the traffic lights. They bought the area between Trumpington Road and the river. This was the county council. But it was the 1940s, there wasn't much money available. Many of the county councillors were very much against it. And consequently, they sold the land off and it stayed where it was. And basically, what happened, of course, was that they simply, very slowly, expanded over the surrounding streets. Broad Street disappeared. Some of the dens and stews of Barnwell disappeared. And then, of course, moved out rather more. And so you get the new health school in, can't remember the name of the street, but just off East Road, the drama studio down Covent Garden, etc. The big office block on Elizabeth Way roundabout, which of course wasn't built for them, but they've moved into there. So it has had an influence, but a less dramatic one, because of course it was never a major landowner. So its influence is very much on there, and of course to a certain extent in the changing character of Mill Road and East Road, with a large student population.
The slide you showed of actually East Road with the trees on the one side and the land sloping down, those trees had a preservation order put on them in the 1970s because they were going to make a dual carriageway on East Road.
That's right, yes, yeah. They're going to slice off the front of Zion Baptist Chapel.
The parents at the school, because that was the Methodist school, they chained themselves to the trees,
Yeah.
etc., etc. Not a peep out of anybody when they tore the whole lot down and built a new school on the site. It's like, oh, those trees don't matter anymore.
Yes.
Just as they were all coming to maturity.
Yeah.
We have this for you here.
That's very kind of you, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I can get that in my bag.
Well, it looks like you've covered all the bases, and I think we can let you go.
Lovely, well, thank you very much. And thank you all for your patience. And if you do want to get in touch with me, you've got my email, haven't you? So you can publicise it.
I've looked him up online many times.
Yeah. akirby121@btinternet.com will find it. So anything you can contribute. And thank you once again for your warm reception. Much appreciated.